A life unseen. Jason Wallace had always been a man of routine, a creature of habit with his life moving forward like the steady tick of a finely crafted clock. His life, though busy and often chaotic, was predictable, exactly how he liked it. As the CEO of a multinational tech company, he had risen to the top by sheer will and determination. Every day started with a run at 5 a.m., followed by hours of work, meetings, and presentations. But despite his outward success, there was something in Jason's life that felt hollow. Even with his sprawling penthouse, luxury cars, and private jets, he knew something was missing. One evening, on his way home from another long day at the office, Jason sat in the back seat of his Bentley, staring absently out of the tinted windows. The evening air was cool, and the city was bathed in the soft, golden glow of a setting sun. He had just closed a multi-million-dollar deal, but the satisfaction he once felt from such victories was no longer there. Instead, he felt a quiet emptiness that gnawed at him, a void he couldn't quite explain. The car slowed to a stop at a red light. As he absent-mindedly scanned the street, his gaze settled on a small figure standing near the curb. A young girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, was there, clutching a worn-out backpack and dressed in clothes that were clearly too big for her. She was holding a cardboard sign, the kind you'd see from homeless people, but Jason could tell she wasn't begging for money. As he squinted through the window, the words on the sign became clearer. Hungry. Please help. Jason sat up straighter in his seat, his heart unexpectedly skipping a beat. The girl's dark brown eyes were filled with a mixture of desperation and fear, but there was also a defiant spark in them, something that seemed out of place for a child so young. She was too far for him to hear her voice, but he could see her lips moving as she approached people passing by. Most people ignored her, walking past quickly with their heads down or looking straight ahead, pretending not to notice. One man, in an expensive suit, waved her off dismissively, his face twisted with irritation, as if she were an inconvenience to his perfectly curated life. Jason felt a sudden rush of anger flood his chest, tightening like a fist. He had seen beggars before, of course, but this was different. There was something about this girl, the way she stood alone against the flow of people, so small yet so determined. Without thinking, Jason leaned forward and spoke to his driver. "Pull over," he said, his voice firm but soft. His driver, Tim, looked at him in the rearview mirror, surprised by the sudden request. "Right here, sir?" he asked, slightly confused, as they were in the middle of a busy downtown street. "Yes, right here." The car eased over to the curb, and Jason stepped out. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement as he made his way toward the girl. She noticed him coming but didn't move, her eyes wary and her hands clutching the sign a little tighter. As he approached, he could see that her clothes, while clean, were too big for her small frame. Her shoes were worn down, the soles almost flat, and her hands were rough, with the dirt of the street caked beneath her fingernails. Jason stopped a few feet away from her, not wanting to intimidate her. He crouched down to her level, his eyes softening as he smiled gently. "Hi," he said, his voice low and kind. "Are you okay?" The girl blinked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. She glanced around, as if checking to see if anyone was watching, then slowly nodded, though it was clear she wasn't. Jason's heart broke a little as he realized just how young she was. Her face, though smudged with dirt, was angelic, with soft brown skin and big, expressive eyes. She looked like she hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. "What's your name?" Jason asked softly, keeping his tone light and non-threatening. "Amara," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of the cardboard sign, her eyes darting back and forth, as if she was waiting for someone to tell her it was okay to talk. "Amara," Jason repeated, smiling as he said her name. "That's a beautiful name. How old are you?" "7," she replied, a little louder this time but still hesitant, as if speaking to a stranger was something she'd been told not to do. "Where are your parents?" Jason asked, though he already had a sinking feeling in his stomach about what the answer would be. Amara's face fell, her lower lip trembling as she tried to keep herself from crying. "I don't know where my mommy is," she whispered, her voice barely holding steady. "She went away a long time ago. I've been with my brother, but—" Her voice trailed off, and Jason noticed the way her small hands shook as she gripped the sign. "But what?" Jason asked gently, leaning in closer. Amara sniffled, wiping at her nose with the back of her hand. "But my brother, he told me to wait here. He said he'd be back, but it's been a long time, and I'm hungry." Jason felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at the girl standing before him, all alone in the bustling city. He had seen so many people in need during his life, but he had never stopped. He had never felt compelled to. Until now. His mind raced, trying to piece together how a child this young could be left on the streets. But more than that, he couldn't shake the overwhelming urge to protect her, to take her away from this place. "Do you live nearby?" he asked, trying to gather more information. Amara shook her head. "We used to live in an apartment, but we had to leave. Now we just find places to stay." Jason felt his heart shatter. He had spent his entire life chasing success, accumulating wealth, and climbing the social ladder, but standing here, looking at this child, this little girl who had been abandoned, who was hungry and afraid, he realized none of that mattered. His success, his wealth, none of it could shield him from the cold, hard reality of the world outside his bubble. "I want you to come with me, Amara," Jason said softly. "I'll get you something to eat, and we'll figure out what to do from there. Would that be okay?" Amara hesitated, her dark eyes filled with uncertainty. She looked down at her sign, then back up at Jason. "Are you gonna take me to the police?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No, sweetie," Jason replied, shaking his head gently. "I'm not going to take you to the police. I just want to make sure you're safe and fed. That's all." Amara stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. Finally, she nodded, her small hand reaching up to take his. Jason felt a surge of emotion as her tiny hand slipped into his. He had never felt more sure of anything in his life. As they walked back to his car, Jason realized that in helping Amara, he was also helping himself. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose beyond business deals and boardroom meetings. This was something real, something that mattered. And in that moment, Jason knew his life was about to change forever. A world beyond wealth. Jason's heart pounded as he held Amara's small hand, leading her back toward his car. The city streets bustled around them, a blur of rushing cars, hurried pedestrians, and flickering neon lights. But for Jason, the world had narrowed down to just him and this little girl. His luxury car, a Bentley with custom leather seats and a driver in a pristine suit, felt like a foreign object now, something out of place in this moment. This wasn't about his usual world anymore. It was about her, and the fragility of her existence. Tim, Jason's driver, stepped out as they approached. His expression turned from polite professionalism to genuine surprise as he took in the sight of the young girl walking beside his boss. He'd worked for Jason long enough to know that his employer wasn't the type of man to make unplanned stops, let alone take strangers into his car. But there was something in Jason's eyes that made Tim hold his tongue. "Everything okay, Mr. Wallace?" Tim asked, casting a quick glance at the girl, who stood shyly behind Jason. Jason nodded. "This is Amara," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight of unspoken concern. "She's going to be joining us for a while. Let's head home." Tim hesitated for a split second, then quickly opened the back door of the Bentley. "Of course, sir." Jason helped Amara into the back seat, and as she settled into the plush leather, her wide eyes took in the opulent surroundings. She ran her small hands over the soft, buttery leather seats, her fingers tracing the seams as if they were the finest thing she'd ever touched. Jason sat beside her, his large frame dwarfing the girl, but he tried to make himself as small and non-threatening as possible. He could sense how overwhelmed she must be. Amara was quiet as the car pulled away from the curb, the noise of the city fading into the background. Jason glanced down at her, noticing how she stared out the window, her face a mixture of awe and confusion. She had likely never been in a car like this before, or maybe never in a car at all. The thought made his chest tighten. "So, Amara," Jason began, his voice soft as he tried to ease her into conversation, "what's your favorite food?" Amara didn't answer right away. She bit her lip, still looking out the window as the towering skyscrapers of downtown gave way to quieter streets lined with trees and expensive homes. Jason realized that asking a child what their favorite food was when they likely hadn't had a decent meal in days might be insensitive. But before he could change the subject, she spoke. "I used to like spaghetti," she said quietly, her voice almost drowned out by the hum of the car. "My mom used to make it sometimes when we had enough money." Jason felt a lump form in his throat. He thought about the last time he had worried about having enough money for anything. It had been years, decades even. For Amara, every meal was probably a small miracle, a day without hunger a gift. "Well, we'll see if we can get you some spaghetti tonight," Jason said, trying to smile. "Do you like meatballs with it?" Amara glanced up at him, her big eyes still cautious but filled with a flicker of curiosity. "I've never had meatballs before." Jason felt his chest tighten again. The things he took for granted, the food, the comfort, the security, were luxuries to this little girl. "You're in for a treat, then," he said, his voice thick with emotion. As the car pulled into the long, winding driveway of Jason's mansion, Amara's eyes grew wide. The sprawling estate was a stark contrast to the noisy, crowded streets she had come from. The house, with its grand stone facade, towering columns, and meticulously manicured gardens, looked like something out of a storybook. It was the kind of place most children could only dream about. Jason watched her face closely, wondering if she felt excitement, fear, or maybe a mix of both. When the car came to a stop, Jason stepped out and offered his hand to Amara. She hesitated, staring at the massive front door that loomed ahead of them. But after a moment, she took his hand and followed him inside. The entryway was grand, with marble floors that gleamed under the chandelier's soft glow. A staircase curved gracefully upward, leading to the second floor where Jason's private quarters were. For a brief moment, Jason was almost embarrassed by the excess of it all. The house felt too big, too cold for just one person. Until now. "Welcome home," Jason said quietly, as they stepped inside. Amara didn't say anything. She just stood there, her eyes wide, taking in the sheer size of the house. She looked so small, so out of place, standing in the middle of the grand foyer with its vaulted ceilings and polished floors. Before Jason could say anything else, the sound of soft footsteps echoed through the hall. His housekeeper, Margaret, appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She was a kind woman in her late 50s, with a warm, motherly demeanor that Jason had always appreciated. Her gray hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her kind eyes softened when she saw Amara standing beside Jason. "Mr. Wallace," Margaret greeted, her voice filled with surprise as her gaze shifted to Amara. "And who is this?" Jason glanced at Amara, unsure how to explain the situation. He had made a career out of giving perfect, well-rehearsed speeches to investors. But now, faced with this little girl and the weight of her situation, he felt at a loss for words. "This is Amara," Jason said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "She's going to be staying with us for a little while." Margaret's eyebrows raised slightly, but she didn't press for details. She had worked for Jason long enough to know when not to ask too many questions. Instead, she smiled warmly at Amara and bent down slightly to be at her level. "Well, Amara," she said kindly, "it's a pleasure to meet you. You must be hungry." Amara nodded, her small hand still gripping the straps of her backpack. "How about I make you something special to eat?" Margaret offered, straightening up and motioning toward the kitchen. "You like spaghetti?" Amara's eyes brightened, and she nodded again, more eagerly this time. "I think we can whip up something tasty for you," Margaret said with a warm smile. "Come on, I'll show you the kitchen." As Margaret led Amara toward the kitchen, Jason stood there for a moment, watching them go. His heart felt heavy with emotions he wasn't used to feeling. Guilt, sadness, and a fierce protectiveness he had never expected. He had never been a father, never even considered it, but something about Amara stirred something deep inside him, a primal instinct to care for her, to shield her from the cruelty of the world. Jason followed them into the kitchen, where Margaret was already bustling around, gathering ingredients for dinner. Amara sat at the kitchen island, her eyes wide as she watched Margaret work, as if the simple act of making a meal was a magical thing. Jason took a seat beside Amara, his mind racing with thoughts about what to do next. He had no idea where Amara's brother was, or if she had any other family. The thought of her being left alone on the streets again was unbearable. He knew he couldn't let that happen. But as he watched Amara, her tiny frame dwarfed by the enormous kitchen island, Jason realized something else. He couldn't just give her a meal and send her back out into the world. He had to do more. He had to figure out how to keep her safe, how to give her a chance at a better life. "Amara," Jason said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence in the kitchen. She looked up at him, her dark eyes curious but still filled with that cautious wariness. "Do you remember the last time you saw your brother?" Amara's face fell slightly, and she looked down at her hands. "He told me to wait for him by the park. He said he'd come back, but it's been a long time." Jason's chest tightened. "How long?" he asked gently. "A few days," Amara whispered. "Maybe a week." Jason swallowed hard. He knew what that meant, even if Amara didn't fully understand it yet. Her brother wasn't coming back. "We're going to figure this out," Jason said, his voice steady and filled with quiet determination. "But for now, you're safe here. You don't have to worry about anything." Amara looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to decide whether or not to believe him. After a moment, she nodded, but Jason could tell that the weight of her young life still hung heavy on her small shoulders. As Margaret set a plate of steaming spaghetti and meatballs in front of Amara, the girl's face lit up with a smile that made Jason's heart ache. She dug in eagerly, savoring every bite, as if it were the best meal she'd ever had. Watching her, Jason made a silent promise to himself. He didn't know exactly what the future held, or how he was going to navigate this new chapter of his life, but he knew one thing for certain. He was not going to let Amara slip through the cracks of a system that had already failed her once. In that moment, as Amara ate her spaghetti and Margaret bustled around the kitchen, Jason felt something shift deep inside him. This was no longer just about helping a little girl in need. This was about making a difference, about stepping into a role he never thought he'd have to fill. Jason Wallace, the man who had built an empire on cold, calculated decisions, was now faced with the most important decision of his life, and it had nothing to do with money or power. It had everything to do with love and the responsibility of being the person Amara needed most. The weight of the unknown. The night after Amara's first real meal, in what must have been days, Jason found himself sitting alone in his expansive study. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the mahogany bookshelves that lined the walls, but the warmth did little to comfort him. His mind raced, filled with thoughts of Amara and the stark reality of her situation. He stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked his meticulously landscaped garden, but all he could see in his mind was Amara standing on that street corner, her small frame trembling with hunger and fear. How many children were like her, invisible in plain sight, begging for help in a world too busy to notice? Jason had built his life on control. Every move in his career, every decision in his personal life was calculated, methodical. But this situation was different. This was messy, unpredictable, and filled with uncertainty. It scared him in a way he hadn't been scared in years. For all his wealth and power, he suddenly felt helpless. As the clock ticked past midnight, Jason heard a soft knock on the study door. He turned to see Margaret standing in the doorway, her expression gentle but concerned. "How is she?" Jason asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Margaret stepped inside, folding her hands in front of her. "She's fast asleep now," she said softly. "The poor thing was exhausted. I doubt she's had a good night's sleep in weeks." Jason nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of the unknown. He hadn't wanted to admit it, but deep down, he feared that Amara's situation might be more complicated than he initially thought. He knew nothing about her brother, or why he'd left her at that park. He didn't even know where to begin looking for answers. "Do you think I did the right thing?" Jason asked, his eyes searching Margaret's face for reassurance. "Bringing her here?" Margaret smiled, her eyes softening with warmth. "You did the only thing you could do, Jason," she said gently. "You saw a little girl in need, and you helped her. That's more than most people would have done." Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. "But what happens next?" he asked, the uncertainty in his voice palpable. "I don't know how to handle this. I'm not equipped for this." Margaret stepped closer, her expression turning serious. "Jason, no one is ever fully prepared for something like this. But the fact that you're even asking yourself these questions means you're already doing the right thing. You've opened your home to this child, and that's a start." Jason nodded, but the weight of the responsibility still pressed down on him. He was used to solving problems with money, with influence, with connections. But this required something far more personal, far more intimate. He sat back in his chair, staring into the fire. "I need to find out more about her situation," he said quietly. "I can't just keep her here without knowing what happened to her brother, or her mother. There has to be someone out there looking for her." Margaret nodded. "It's a good idea. But be careful, Jason. Amara's been through enough. You don't want to push too hard or overwhelm her with questions. Let her open up in her own time." Jason knew she was right. He couldn't force Amara to tell him more than she was ready to share. But he also knew that time wasn't on their side. If Amara's brother had abandoned her, there might be deeper reasons that could put her in even more danger. He needed to act, but he had to do it carefully. "Thanks, Margaret," Jason said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Margaret smiled and patted his shoulder gently before turning to leave. "I'll be around if you need anything. Try to get some rest, Jason. Tomorrow's a new day." But Jason knew sleep wouldn't come easily. He stayed in the study long after Margaret left, lost in thought, trying to figure out his next move. He could handle complex business negotiations with ease, but this was something far more delicate. The next morning, Jason awoke early, the first rays of dawn filtering through his bedroom windows. Despite his late night, he felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't sure exactly what his plan would be, but he knew he had to take action. He had to start somewhere. After a quick shower, Jason headed downstairs to the kitchen, where the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. He found Margaret bustling around, preparing breakfast as usual, and Amara sitting at the kitchen island, quietly nibbling on a piece of toast. She looked much better than she had the night before, cleaner, more rested, but there was still a shadow in her eyes that Jason couldn't ignore. "Good morning," Jason said softly as he entered the room. Amara looked up at him, her expression cautious but curious. "Morning," she replied, her voice still small. Jason poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching her for a moment. He didn't want to overwhelm her, but he also knew they needed to talk. He needed to understand more about her life before they could move forward. "Did you sleep okay?" Jason asked, trying to keep the conversation light. Amara nodded, though she didn't say much else. Jason could tell she was still trying to figure out if she could trust him. He didn't blame her. It wasn't easy to trust strangers, especially after everything she'd been through. After a few moments of silence, Jason set his coffee down and took a seat across from Amara at the kitchen island. "I've been thinking," he began carefully, "about how we can help find your brother. Do you remember the last place you saw him?" Amara's face tensed slightly, and she shifted in her seat. "It was at the park," she said quietly, her eyes lowering to her plate. "He told me to wait there, but he never came back." Jason's heart broke a little more hearing her say it again. He could only imagine how long she had waited, how scared she must have been. "Do you know why he left you there?" he asked gently. Amara shook her head. "He said he had to go take care of something. He promised he'd be back." Jason nodded, though he could tell there was more to the story that Amara wasn't saying. He didn't want to push her, but he needed more information if they were going to find out what happened to her brother. "Do you know if your brother had any friends or anyone he stayed with?" Jason asked, trying a different approach. "Maybe someone who could help us find him." Amara's brow furrowed, and she thought for a moment. "There was a man. My brother knew him. He worked at one of the corner stores near where we used to live." Jason's ears perked up at this new piece of information. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. "Do you remember the name of the store?" Amara hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't remember the name, but it had a red sign." Jason made a mental note of the detail. It wasn't much to go on, but he could start there. He could ask around, see if anyone in that area had seen Amara's brother. "Thank you for telling me," Jason said gently, giving her a reassuring smile. "We'll figure this out. But for now, I want you to know that you're safe here. You don't have to worry about anything, okay?" Amara nodded again, her expression still guarded, but Jason could see the tiniest flicker of relief in her eyes. Later that morning, Jason made a few phone calls. He reached out to one of his private investigators, a man named Evan Mitchell, who had worked for him on several discrete business matters over the years. Evan was thorough, reliable, and most importantly, he knew how to ask the right questions without drawing too much attention. "Evan, I need your help with something a little unusual," Jason said once Evan picked up the call. Evan's voice came through the line, professional as always. "What's going on, Jason?" Jason hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to reveal. "There's a young girl, Amara. I found her on the street yesterday. She's been separated from her brother, and I need to find him. She mentioned something about a man her brother knew who worked at a corner store with a red sign, near where they used to live." Evan was silent for a moment, taking in the information. "I'll see what I can dig up. Do you have any more details on the brother?" "Not much," Jason admitted. "I don't even know his name. But Amara said he left her at the park, and she hasn't seen him in a while." Evan's voice was calm but determined. "I'll look into it. I'll start with the area around the park and see if anyone knows anything about a missing girl or her brother. I'll keep it discreet." "Thanks, Evan," Jason said, relief flooding through him. "I owe you one." "Don't worry about it," Evan replied. "I'll be in touch as soon as I have something." As Jason hung up the phone, he felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and there was a long road ahead, but he was determined to find out what happened to Amara's brother and to give her the safety and stability she deserved. Later that afternoon, Jason found Amara in the living room, sitting quietly on the sofa with a book in her lap. She looked so small, so out of place in the grand room with its high ceilings and ornate furniture. But there was something about the way she held herself, something strong and resilient, that reminded Jason of why he couldn't give up on her. He sat down beside her, careful not to crowd her space. "I talked to someone today," he said softly. "Someone who can help us find your brother. It might take some time, but we're going to figure this out." Amara looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "Do you really think you can find him?" Jason nodded, his voice steady. "We're going to do everything we can, and in the meantime, you don't have to worry about anything. You're safe here." Amara didn't say anything, but after a moment, she leaned against him, just slightly, as if testing the waters. Jason felt his heart swell with emotion as he wrapped his arm around her gently, offering her the comfort and security she so desperately needed. For the first time in a long time, Jason felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. This wasn't about deals or profits or boardroom negotiations. This was about a little girl who needed someone to believe in her, to protect her, and to give her a chance at a better life. As they sat there in the quiet of the afternoon, Jason knew that this was only the beginning. The journey ahead would be filled with challenges and unknowns, but he was ready to face them head-on. For Amara's sake, for her future, he was willing to do whatever it took. And for the first time in years, Jason Wallace felt like he was truly alive. Beneath the surface, a week passed, and Amara had begun to settle into the Wallace household in a way that neither Jason nor Margaret had expected. Though still quiet and often reserved, she was gradually opening up, her cautious steps turning into more comfortable strides. Jason noticed how her guarded gaze softened when she spoke with Margaret, especially over breakfast, where Amara seemed to find comfort in the predictable routine of toast and eggs, or whatever Margaret had prepared that morning. Jason's mornings, however, were filled with new layers of complexity. His usual routine of early morning jogs followed by business meetings had shifted dramatically. He found himself waking up earlier to check in on Amara, making sure she was okay before tackling the day ahead. And though his professional life was still thriving, his company preparing to launch a groundbreaking new product, his focus kept slipping away from boardrooms and budgets and drifting back to the girl now living under his roof. Even his private investigator had been working tirelessly to track down any leads on Amara's brother. But so far, the trail had gone cold. There were vague reports of a young man matching the description of Amara's brother, often spotted around the area she'd mentioned, but nothing concrete. No sightings, no addresses. Jason's frustration grew with each passing day, the uncertainty gnawing at him. How could someone just disappear like that? And more importantly, why had Amara's brother left her? Jason sat at his desk, staring blankly at his laptop. His inbox was full of urgent emails, documents needing approval, and reminders of upcoming investor meetings, but none of it seemed to matter right now. His mind kept circling back to the same question. What would he do if they couldn't find Amara's brother? He had promised her they'd figure it out, but what if there was nothing to figure out? What if the young man had truly abandoned her? A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Margaret stepped into the room, her expression calm, but with an underlying sense of urgency. "Jason," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I think you should come downstairs." Jason's stomach clenched, instantly fearing the worst. "Is something wrong with Amara?" he asked, standing up from his desk. Margaret shook her head, but her expression didn't ease. "She's fine, but she's been asking some questions. I think it's time you had a proper talk with her." Jason's heart sank. He had been dreading this conversation, the one where he would have to tell Amara that they still hadn't found any solid leads on her brother. He had wanted to wait until they had more concrete information, but it seemed that waiting was no longer an option. He followed Margaret downstairs, where Amara was sitting in the living room, curled up on the couch with one of Margaret's homemade quilts wrapped around her. She was staring at the window, her dark eyes distant, as though she were searching for something far beyond the horizon. Jason hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room. "Amara," he said softly, his voice cutting through the silence. She turned her head, her expression unreadable. "Hi," she said quietly, pulling the quilt tighter around her shoulders. Jason sat down in the armchair across from her, trying to choose his words carefully. "I know you've been wondering about your brother," he began, keeping his tone gentle. "I've been doing everything I can to find him, and I've hired someone who's looking for him too. But so far, we haven't found him yet." Amara's face didn't change much, but Jason saw the flicker of disappointment in her eyes. She looked down at her hands, which were nervously twisting the edge of the quilt. Do you think he's not coming back?" She asked in a voice so soft, Jason almost didn't hear it. The question hit Jason harder than he expected. He had thought about that possibility himself, late at night when the house was quiet, and his thoughts were too loud to ignore. But hearing Amara's voice, it brought a new level of pain. She had already been abandoned once. How could he possibly tell her that it might happen again? I don't know, Jason said, his voice thick with emotion. But I don't want you to worry about that right now. We're doing everything we can to find him. And in the meantime, you're safe here. Amara nodded, but she didn't look up. Jason could see the weight of the unknown pressing down on her small frame. She had been strong for so long, holding herself together, but now the cracks were starting to show. She whispered, her voice barely audible. I just want to know why he left me. Jason's heart broke a little more with every word she said. He wanted to give her answers, to tell her everything would be okay. But the truth was he didn't know, and that helplessness was something he wasn't used to. In his world, there was always a solution, always a way to fix things. But this was beyond his control. You know, Jason said after a long pause, sometimes people make decisions because they think it's what's best, even if it doesn't seem like it. Maybe your brother thought he was protecting you in some way. Amara frowned, her brow furrowed in confusion. How is leaving me alone in a park protecting me? Jason didn't have an answer for that. He could only guess at the brother's motivations, and none of those guesses were comforting. But he couldn't let Amara see his uncertainty. She needed someone to believe in, someone she could trust. I don't know, Jason admitted, but I do know that none of this is your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. Amara looked up at him then, her eyes searching his face for the truth in his words. After a moment, she nodded, though Jason could tell she wasn't fully convinced. But for now, it was enough. As the conversation came to a quiet close, Jason felt a deep sense of responsibility settle over him. Amara had come into his life unexpectedly, and with her had come a set of challenges he hadn't been prepared for. But he was determined to see this through, no matter what it took. Later that day, after Amara had gone to bed, Jason made another phone call. This time, it wasn't to Evan. He needed answers about something more personal. Something that had been nagging at the back of his mind since the moment Amara had stepped into his life. The call rang a few times before a woman's voice picked up. Dr. Levine's office. How can I help you? Jason cleared his throat. This is Jason Wallace. I need to make an appointment with Dr. Levine as soon as possible. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and then the woman replied, Of course, Mr. Wallace. We'll get you in first thing tomorrow morning. The following day, Jason found himself sitting in the small, sterile office of Dr. Evelyn Levine, a child psychologist who had come highly recommended by one of Jason's most trusted colleagues. Dr. Levine was a middle-aged woman with short, salt-and-pepper hair and kind, intelligent eyes. Her office was decorated with soft, soothing colors, and toys and books were neatly arranged in one corner, clearly meant to make young patients feel more comfortable. So, Mr. Wallace, Dr. Levine began, sitting down in the chair across from him. What brings you here today? Jason shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I had recently taken in a young girl, Amara, he explained, his voice slightly hesitant. She's been through a lot, and I want to make sure I'm doing everything I can to help her. But I don't really know where to start. Dr. Levine nodded, her expression thoughtful. Tell me more about Amara. What has she been through? Jason took a deep breath and recounted the story of how he had found Amara on the street, how her brother had left her at the park, and how they still hadn't been able to find him. He explained how Amara had slowly begun to open up, but there were still so many things she wasn't saying, so many emotions she was keeping bottled up inside. I want to help her, Jason said, his voice filled with frustration. But I don't know how to reach her. I don't know what she needs. Dr. Levine listened carefully, her eyes never leaving Jason's face. When he finished, she leaned back slightly in her chair, her fingers tapping thoughtfully on the armrest. Amara has been through a significant trauma, she said gently. Being abandoned by someone she trusted, especially at such a young age, can have a profound impact on her sense of security. She may be struggling with feelings of rejection, fear, and confusion, and until she understands why her brother left, she may have a hard time fully trusting anyone, even you. Jason nodded, his chest tightening. He had suspected as much, but hearing it from a professional made it all the more real. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "How can I help her?" Dr. Levine smiled softly. "The best thing you can do right now is provide her with stability. She needs to know that you're not going anywhere, that you're someone she can rely on. It's going to take time for her to fully open up, and you can't rush that process. But by being there for her, by showing her that she's safe, you're already helping her more than you realize." Jason let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "So I just keep doing what I'm doing." "For now, yes," Dr. Levine said with a nod. "But I would also suggest having her come in for a session with me. Talking to a professional can sometimes help children process their emotions in a way that's less overwhelming. And if there are deeper issues at play, we can address those together." Jason nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He had been so worried that he was failing Amara, that he wasn't doing enough. But now, at least, he had a plan. He could take the next steps. When Jason returned home later that evening, he found Amara in the backyard, sitting on the edge of the fountain that overlooked the garden. She was quiet, her small figure framed by the fading light of the setting sun. Jason approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Hey," he said softly, sitting down beside her. Amara glanced up at him, then looked back at the water. "Hi." They sat in silence for a few moments, the soft gurgling of the fountain the only sound between them. Jason wasn't sure how to start the conversation, but eventually, Amara spoke. "Do you think my brother will ever come back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason swallowed hard, his heart aching for her. He didn't want to lie to her, but he also didn't want to crush her hope. "I don't know, Amara," he said gently. "But I do know that no matter what happens, you're not alone. You have people who care about you. You have me." Amara looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with uncertainty. But for the first time, Jason saw something else in her gaze, something fragile but real. Trust. That night, after Amara had gone to bed, Jason stood in the hallway outside her room, staring at the closed door. The weight of the day pressed down on him, but there was also a sense of quiet resolve growing in his chest. He didn't know what the future held for Amara. He didn't know if they would ever find her brother, or if the answers she so desperately needed would ever come. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to abandon her. Not now. Not ever. And as Jason turned to walk back to his own room, he realized that this journey, the one he hadn't planned, the one that had appended his perfectly controlled life, was just beginning. But he was ready for it. For Amara, he would face whatever came next, the fragile threads of hope. The days passed with a quiet rhythm at the Wallace estate. Amara was slowly adjusting to her new life, though the scars of her past were still visible in the way she sometimes flinched at sudden noises or fell into long, pensive silences. Jason did his best to give her space, but he could see the weight of her unspoken fears and unanswered questions lingering just beneath the surface. Even the private investigator continued his search for Amara's brother. Every few days, he would call Jason with an update, though each one seemed to bring more frustration than progress. There were sightings of young men who vaguely fit the description, but none turned out to be Amara's brother. Even had tracked down the corner store Amara had mentioned, and while the owner vaguely remembered a young man who had come in regularly for a few weeks, he couldn't offer much more than that. Jason found himself growing increasingly anxious. He had thought that with enough resources and determination, they would find Amara's brother quickly, but the reality was proving to be far more complicated. And as the days turned into weeks, he began to wonder if they would ever find him at all. Amara, for her part, seemed to sense the growing tension. She had stopped asking Jason about her brother, but her eyes still held that same quiet sadness, the longing for answers she couldn't put into words. She had built a fragile sense of security in the Wallace household, but Jason knew that without closure, without understanding why her brother had left, that security could shatter at any moment. One evening, as Jason was preparing to leave the office and head home, Evan called. "I've got something," Evan said, his voice low and serious. Jason's heart skipped a beat. "You found him?" "I think so," Evan replied. "I tracked down a shelter on the outskirts of the city. A few of the staff members recognized the description of Amara's brother. He's been staying there on and off for the past few months." Jason stood up from his desk, his pulse quickening. "Does he know we're looking for him?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "That's the thing, Jason. From what I've gathered, he's been avoiding any questions about his sister. The shelter staff tried to help him, but he kept disappearing before they could get him to talk about anything personal. It's like he's running from something." Jason's heart sank. He had hoped that finding Amara's brother would bring some sense of relief, some kind of resolution. But now it seemed like the situation was even more complicated than he had imagined. What could drive a young man to abandon his little sister and then actively avoid being found? "Where is he now?" Jason asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know," Evan admitted. "He left the shelter again a few days ago, but the staff thinks he'll be back. It's the only place he seems to return to, probably because he doesn't have anywhere else to go." Jason rubbed a hand over his face, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "Keep looking," he said finally, "and let me know as soon as you have anything else." After hanging up, Jason sat back in his chair, staring out the window of his office. The city skyline was bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, but the beauty of it was lost on him. All he could think about was Amara, and how he was going to tell her that they had found her brother. Sort of. He couldn't hide the truth from her, but how could he tell her that her brother had been avoiding being found? That evening, when Jason arrived home, the house was unusually quiet. He found Margaret in the kitchen, tidying up after dinner. "Where's Amara?" Jason asked, glancing around. "She's outside," Margaret replied, her voice gentle. "She's been spending a lot of time by the fountain lately. I think it helps her think." Jason nodded and made his way through the house, stepping out into the cool evening air. The garden was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, the last rays of sunlight casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. In the distance, he could see Amara sitting by the fountain, her small figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. As he got closer, he could see that she was holding something in her hands, a small photograph, worn and creased from being handled too many times. Jason recognized it immediately. It was the only picture she had of her family, the one she had kept tucked away in her backpack when she first arrived. Jason said softly as he sat down beside her. Amara didn't look up. She was staring at the photograph, her fingers tracing the edges of the image as if trying to hold on to the memories it contained. "I miss him," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason's heart ached at the sadness in her words. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to ease the pain she was feeling. "I know," he said gently. "I miss him too." Amara glanced up at him then, her eyes filled with questions she didn't know how to ask. Jason took a deep breath, knowing he couldn't delay the conversation any longer. "I've been looking for your brother," he began slowly, "and I think we found him." Amara's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. You found him." Jason nodded, though the heaviness in his chest made it hard to speak. "He's been staying at a shelter, but he hasn't been easy to find. He keeps leaving before anyone can talk to him." Amara frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. Why would he leave? Why wouldn't he want to be found? Jason hesitated, searching for the right words. He didn't want to burden her with more than she could handle, but she deserved the truth. "I don't know. "Amara," he admitted. "But I think he's scared. Maybe he thinks he failed you, or maybe he's dealing with something else. Whatever it is, he's been avoiding talking to anyone about it." Amara's face fell, and she looked down at the photograph in her hands. For a long moment, she was silent, her small fingers gripping the edges of the picture tightly. "Do you think he'll ever come back for me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jason's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her that everything would be okay, that her brother would come back and explain everything. But he couldn't lie to her. He had no idea what her brother was thinking, or if he would ever come back at all. "I don't know," Jason said softly, his voice filled with sadness. "But no matter what happens, you're not alone. I'm here for you." Amara nodded, but Jason could see the disappointment in her eyes. She had been holding on to hope for so long, and now that hope was starting to slip through her fingers like sand. They sat in silence for a while, the soft sound of the fountain the only noise in the garden. Jason wanted to say something, to offer her some kind of comfort, but he didn't know how. He wasn't used to this kind of emotional vulnerability. In his world, problems were solved with money and power, not with words of comfort or reassurance. But as he sat there beside Amara, he realized that this was different. This wasn't about finding the right business strategy or negotiating the best deal. This was about being there for a little girl who had been through more pain and uncertainty than most adults could handle. Eventually, Amara spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. What if he doesn't want me anymore?" Jason's heart broke at the question. He wanted to wrap her in his arms, to tell her that she was wanted, that she was loved, but he didn't want to push her. He had to let her come to that realization on her own. "Amara," he said softly, "your brother loves you. I'm sure of that. But sometimes people make decisions because they think it's what's best, even if it doesn't make sense. Whatever's going on with your brother, it's not about you. It's about him. And that doesn't mean he doesn't care about you." Amara didn't respond, but Jason could see the conflict in her eyes. She was trying to hold on to that belief, trying to trust that her brother hadn't abandoned her completely. But the fear of being unwanted, of being left behind, was still there, lurking in the shadows of her heart. That night, after Amara had gone to bed, Jason found himself once again in his study, staring into the fire. He had hoped that finding Amara's brother would bring some kind of resolution, but now it seemed that things were even more complicated. If her brother didn't want to be found, what did that mean for Amara? Could she ever truly heal if she didn't have the answers she was searching for? Jason's phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw Evan's name. "Jason." Evan's voice came through the line, calm but with a note of urgency. "I think I've found him." Jason's heart raced. "Where is he?" "He came back to the shelter today," Evan explained. "But he's not in great shape. The staff thinks he's been living on the streets for a while now. They're trying to convince him to stay, but I don't know how long he'll be there." Jason stood up from his chair, his mind racing. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." The drive to the shelter felt longer than it actually was. Jason's mind was spinning with possibilities. What would he say to Amara's brother? How would he convince him to come back? And more importantly, how would Amara react when she found out? When he arrived at the shelter, the staff directed him to a small room in the back where Amara's brother was resting. Jason's heart pounded as he approached the door, his mind racing with a mixture of hope and anxiety. He knocked softly before entering, and when he stepped inside, he saw a young man sitting on a cot, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. His clothes were dirty, his hair disheveled, and there was a haunted look in his eyes that told Jason everything he needed to know. This was a young man who had been running from his past, from his pain, from everything. And now he looked like he had nowhere left to go. Jason took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I'm Jason Wallace," he said softly, his voice calm but firm. "I've been looking for you." The young man looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "I know who you are," he said quietly. "You're the guy taking care of Amara." Jason nodded. "That's right. She's been staying with me for the past few weeks." For a moment, there was silence. The young man, Amara's brother, looked away, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. "I couldn't take care of her," he said, his voice barely audible. "I tried, but I failed." Jason's heart ached at the pain in his words. He could see the guilt and shame written all over the young man's face, the weight of his perceived failure crushing him. "You didn't fail her," Jason said gently. "You did what you thought was best. But she needs you. She's been waiting for you." Amara's brother shook his head, his voice trembling with emotion. "I can't go back. She's better off without me." Jason stepped closer, his voice filled with quiet determination. "She loves you. She doesn't care about your mistakes or what you've been through. She just wants her brother back." The young man looked up at Jason, his eyes filled with uncertainty. For a long moment, there was silence between them, the weight of the past pressing down on both of them. Finally, Amara's brother spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I'm strong enough." Jason knelt down in front of him, meeting his gaze head-on. "You don't have to do it alone. I'll help you. We'll help you." The young man's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, Jason saw the flicker of hope in his gaze, the same fragile hope that Amara had been holding onto for so long. Maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what had been broken. And as Jason helped Amara's brother stand, he knew that this was the beginning of a long, difficult journey, a journey of healing, forgiveness, and redemption. But it was a journey they would take together. For Amara, for her future, they would find a way. The road to healing. The drive back to the Wallace estate felt heavy with anticipation. Jason glanced in the rearview mirror at Amara's brother, Malik, who sat in the back seat, his face shadowed with exhaustion and a mixture of shame and uncertainty. Malik had barely spoken since they left the shelter, his eyes distant as if he were already preparing for the worst. Jason had never felt this kind of responsibility before, not for someone else's emotional well-being, at least. He had made billion-dollar decisions without breaking a sweat, had been in high-stakes negotiations that would determine the fate of his company, but none of that had prepared him for the emotional gravity of this moment. He was driving toward a reunion that could either heal old wounds or deepen the scars they both carried. As they pulled into the long driveway of the Wallace estate, Malik shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The grandeur of the house loomed ahead, its stone walls bathed in the soft glow of the evening lights. Malik had lived most of his life in rundown apartments or cramped shelters, places where survival was the goal, not comfort. Now, here he was, about to face his little sister in a house that seemed like a different world altogether. Jason parked the car and turned to Malik, who was staring out of the window, his jaw clenched. "She's been waiting for this moment," Jason said gently, hoping to ease the tension. "She doesn't care about what's happened in the past. She just wants to see you." Malik didn't respond right away. His eyes were still fixed on the house, but Jason could see the fear etched into his expression. Finally, Malik spoke, his voice barely audible. "What if she hates me?" Jason's chest tightened. He had seen the pain Amara carried, the questions that haunted her about why her brother had left. But he also knew that more than anything, Amara wanted to understand, to make sense of the abandonment, and to know that Malik hadn't left her because he didn't love her. "She doesn't hate you," Jason said softly. "She's confused, and she's been through a lot. But she loves you, Malik. You're her brother. That's never going to change." Malik swallowed hard, his throat botting as he tried to keep his emotions in check. He nodded, though Jason could see the fear still lingering in his eyes. Jason opened the car door and stepped out, watching as Malik hesitated for a moment before following suit. The two of them walked toward the front door in silence, the sound of gravel crunching under their feet the only noise in the stillness of the evening. When they reached the door, Jason paused, his hand hovering over the door handle. "Ready?" Jason asked, giving Malik one last chance to gather his courage. Malik took a deep breath and nodded, though his hands were trembling slightly. Jason pushed open the door, and they stepped inside. The house was quiet, the soft glow of the chandelier casting long shadows across the polished floor. Jason could hear voices coming from the living room, and as they made their way down the hallway, his heart pounded in his chest. When they reached the doorway to the living room, Jason stopped, allowing Malik to step inside first. Margaret was sitting on the couch, reading a book, and beside her, curled up in a corner with a blanket wrapped around her, was Amara. Her dark eyes were focused on the fireplace, the flames casting a soft, warm light over her small frame. At the sound of footsteps, Amara looked up, her eyes widening in shock as they landed on the figure standing just inside the doorway. For a moment, she didn't move. It was as if time had stopped, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. "Malik?" she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. Malik stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile, as both brother and sister struggled to find their footing in this long-awaited moment. Amara's blanket slipped from her shoulders as she slowly stood up, her eyes never leaving Malik's face. She took a hesitant step forward, then another, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts as the reality of the situation began to sink in. "You're here," she whispered again, as if saying the words would make them more real. Malik nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He looked down at his hands, as if ashamed to meet her gaze. I'm sorry, Amara," he finally managed to choke out, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I'm so sorry." The tears that Amara had been holding back for so long finally spilled over. She ran to her brother, throwing her arms around him in a desperate, almost frantic embrace. Malik stiffened at first, clearly overwhelmed by the intensity of her emotions, but after a moment, he wrapped his arms around her, holding her as tightly as he could. Jason felt a lump form in his throat as he watched the two siblings cling to each other, the weight of their separation, their pain, and their love crashing down on them all at once. "You left me." Amara sobbed into Malik's chest, her voice broken. "You left me all alone. I didn't know what to do." "I know," Malik whispered, his voice filled with guilt and regret. "I didn't want to, Amara. I didn't. But I had no choice." Amara pulled back slightly, looking up at him with tear-streaked cheeks and wide, questioning eyes. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling with the pain of a child who had been searching for answers for far too long. "Why did you leave me?" Malik's face crumpled, his emotions raw and unguarded. He sank down to the floor, pulling Amara down with him, so they were sitting side by side, their hands still intertwined. For a long moment, he didn't speak, his eyes focused on the ground as he struggled to find the words. I thought I was doing the right thing," Malik began, his voice barely above a whisper. "After Mom died, I didn't know how to take care of you. I tried, but everything kept falling apart. I couldn't get a job, we couldn't afford rent, and every day felt like a fight just to survive. I didn't want you to see how bad things were getting." Amara sniffled, her tears slowing but her grip on Malik's hand tightening. "But why didn't you come back? You said you would come back." Malik closed his eyes, his jaw clenched as he tried to hold back his own tears. "I wanted to," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "But after I left you at the park, I got into some trouble. I didn't want you to see me like that. I didn't want you to get caught up in everything that was happening to me." Amara's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean? What kind of trouble?" Malik hesitated, glancing up at Jason as if silently asking for help. Jason stepped forward, kneeling beside them. "Amara," he said gently, "your brother was trying to protect you in his own way. He thought that by staying away, he was keeping you safe." Amara looked back at Malik, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "But I didn't care about any of that," she said softly. "I just wanted you to be there." Malik let out a shaky breath, his eyes filled with tears. "I know," he whispered. "I was wrong. I thought I was doing what was best for you, but I hurt you instead. I didn't know how to fix it." Amara rested her head on his shoulder, her small body trembling with the weight of her emotions. "I just wanted you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Malik wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "I'm so sorry, Amara," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll never leave you again. I promise." Jason stood up, his heart aching as he watched the two of them, their reunion raw and fragile but filled with the hope of healing. He knew that this moment wouldn't erase the pain they had both been through, but it was a start, a step toward rebuilding the bond that had been broken. Over the next few days, Malik stayed at the Wallace estate, slowly adjusting to the idea that he didn't have to run anymore. Jason had offered him a room, a place to stay until he figured out his next steps, but Malik was hesitant. He wasn't used to relying on anyone for help, and the guilt of what he had put Amara through still weighed heavily on him. Amara, on the other hand, seemed to blossom now that her brother was back in her life. She had always been a quiet, reserved child, but now there was a new light in her eyes, a sense of security that hadn't been there before. She spent every waking moment with Malik, clinging to him as if afraid that if she let go, he might disappear again. Jason watched them with a mixture of relief and concern. While he was glad that Malik had come back, he knew that there were deeper issues that needed to be addressed. Malik still carried the weight of his past, the mistakes he had made, and the guilt of abandoning Amara. And Amara, despite her joy at having her brother back, still had questions that couldn't be answered with a simple apology. One afternoon, Jason sat down with Malik in the kitchen, the soft hum of the dishwasher filling the silence between them. Malik looked tired, the weight of the past few days evident in the dark circles under his eyes. "I appreciate everything you've done for Amara," Malik said quietly, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. "I don't know what would have happened to her if you hadn't found her." Jason nodded, his eyes focused on Malik's face. "I'm glad I found her," he said honestly. "But this isn't just about what happened in the past. You're back now, and that's what matters." Malik looked down at his hands, his fingers tightening around the mug. "I don't know if I deserve to be back," he admitted, his voice filled with shame. "I left her. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I just made everything worse." Jason leaned forward, his expression serious but compassionate. "We all make mistakes, Malik. What matters now is what you do moving forward. Amara doesn't need you to be perfect. She just needs you to be there." Malik nodded, though the doubt in his eyes didn't completely fade. "I want to be there for her," he said quietly, "but I don't know if I'm ready. I don't even know how to take care of myself, let alone someone else." Jason understood that feeling all too well. He had felt the same uncertainty when he first brought Amara into his home, the same fear that he wasn't capable of giving her what she needed. But over time, he had realized that being there, showing up even when it was hard, was what mattered most. "You don't have to do it alone," Jason said, his voice steady. "I'm here. Margaret's here. We'll help you. And if you're willing, I think it would be good for you and Amara to talk to someone. Someone who can help you both work through everything that's happened." Malik glanced up at him, his eyes wary. "A therapist?" Jason nodded. "I've been talking to a child psychologist, Dr. Levine. She's been helping me understand what Amara needs, and I think she could help you both. It's not about fixing everything overnight, but it's a step toward healing." Malik was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. Jason could see the battle playing out in his mind. The fear of facing his past, the uncertainty of the future. But after a long pause, Malik nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll do it." Jason felt a wave of relief wash over him. This was the first real step toward healing, not just for Malik, but for Amara as well. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be setbacks along the way, but they were moving in the right direction. Over the next few weeks, the Wallace estate became a place of healing for both Malik and Amara. They attended therapy sessions together, slowly unpacking the pain and confusion of the past year. Dr. Levine worked with them to rebuild their relationship, helping Malik understand the impact his actions had on Amara, and helping Amara express the hurt and fear she had carried for so long. The process wasn't easy. There were days when Malik would retreat into himself, consumed by guilt and shame, and days when Amara's anger would bubble to the surface, her frustration at being left behind spilling over in tears and outbursts. But through it all, they stayed together, holding on to the fragile threads of hope that had begun to weave their way through their lives. Jason watched from the sidelines, offering support when needed but giving them space to heal on their own terms. He had never expected to become so deeply involved in their lives, but now that he couldn't imagine stepping away. Amara had become like a daughter to him, and Malik, despite his struggles, had become someone Jason respected for his strength and determination to make things right. One evening, as the sun set over the estate, Jason found Amara and Malik sitting by the fountain in the garden, the soft murmur of their voices blending with the sound of the water. Amara was laughing at something Malik had said, her face lit up with the kind of joy that had been absent for so long. Jason stood at a distance, watching them with a smile. It had been a long, difficult road, but they were healing. Slowly, steadily, they were finding their way back to each other. As he turned to walk back inside, Jason felt a sense of peace settle over him. This journey, this unexpected twist in his life, had brought him more fulfillment than any business deal or professional success ever could. It had taught him the value of love, of family, and of showing up for the people who needed you most. And as the stars began to twinkle in the evening sky, Jason knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. They had become a family, not by blood, but by choice, by love, and by the shared commitment to healing the wounds of the past. And that, Jason realized, was more precious than anything else in the world.